The interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and old cigarette smoke. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat in the metal chair, her hands resting on the cold table in front of her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her tired face. She had been sitting there for 3 hours, waiting for someone to believe her story. Colonel Marcus Brennan entered the room with the confidence of a man who had seen it all. He was a decorated officer with 30 years of military service under his belt. His uniform was pressed to perfection, and his gray hair was cropped short in the military style. He carried a thick folder under his arm. She dropped on the table with a loud thud. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She had been through hell in the past 48 hours, and now she had to convince this man that she was telling the truth. The colonel pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, studying her face with the intensity of a hawk watching its prey. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he began, his voice deep and authoritative, "do you understand the gravity of the accusations being made against you?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. But I'm telling you the truth. Everything I reported is exactly what happened." The colonel opened the folder and pulled out several photographs. He spread them across the table, each one showing the aftermath of the mission that had gone wrong. Buildings reduced to rubble, vehicles overturned, and the scene of what appeared to be a massacre. His finger tapped on one particular photo. "According to your report, you were at the extraction point when the ambush occurred. You claim you tried to save your team, but were forced to retreat under heavy fire." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "The problem, Lieutenant, is that no one else survived to corroborate your story." Sarah felt her chest tighten. This was the moment she had been dreading. "Sir, I know how it looks, but how it looks," the colonel interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "It looks like you abandoned your unit and fabricated a story to cover your tracks. We found you 12 miles from the extraction point, hiding in an abandoned warehouse. Your weapon was clean. You had barely any dirt on your uniform. And you expect me to believe you were in the middle of a firefight?" She swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "I didn't abandon anyone. I was thrown from the vehicle during the initial explosion. When I came to, I was separated from the others. I heard the gunfire, but by the time I got back to the location, everyone was already gone." Colonel Brennan stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. Outside, the military base was bustling with activity. Soldiers jogged in formation, vehicles moved back and forth, and somewhere in the distance, a helicopter took off. "You know what I think, Lieutenant?" He turned back to face her. "I think you got scared. I think when things went sideways, you ran. And now you're trying to save your career by playing the victim." Sarah's hands balled into fists on the table. "That's not true, sir. I would never abandon my team. Those were my friends out there. We trained together for months. Do you really think I would just leave them to die?" The colonel walked back to the table and sat down again. He pulled out another document from the folder, this one a transcript of her initial debriefing. "Let's go through your story again, from the beginning, and this time, I want every detail." Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount the events. The mission had been straightforward on paper. Her unit was supposed to infiltrate a compound on the outskirts of a hostile territory, gather intelligence on weapons smuggling operations, and extract before dawn. They had done similar missions dozens of times before. "We left the base at 2100 hours, she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "There were 6 of us in 2 vehicles. Sergeant Davis was driving the lead, vehicle with Corporal Jackson and Private Lee. I was in the second vehicle with Captain Reynolds and Private Martinez." The colonel listened, occasionally jotting down notes on a pad of paper. His expression remained skeptical, but he let her continue without interruption. "Everything was going according to plan. We reached the compound without incident and split into 2 teams. Captain Reynolds took Jackson and Lee to survey the perimeter while the rest of us set up surveillance equipment. We were there for maybe 90 minutes, gathering data, taking photographs." She paused, remembering the moment when everything changed. The memory was so vivid it felt like it was happening all over again. "At 2340, we got a message over the radio. Captain Reynolds reported movement in the compound. More people than we expected. He wanted to abort the mission and fall back to the extraction point. We packed up our equipment and headed back to the vehicles. The colonel looked up from his notes. And this is where your story becomes problematic. The extraction point was supposed to be a secure location 3 miles from the compound. But somehow, the enemy knew exactly where you would be. I don't know how they knew, Sarah admitted. Maybe they followed us. Maybe they had informants. All I know is that we were ambushed the moment we arrived at the extraction point. She described the chaos that followed. The sudden explosion that ripped through the lead vehicle, sending it flipping through the air. The barrage of gunfire that came from all directions. The screams of her teammates as they tried to take cover and return fire. I was knocked unconscious by the blast, she continued. When I woke up, I was lying in a ditch about 50 yards from the vehicles. My ears were ringing, and I couldn't see straight. Everything was on fire. I could hear voices shouting in a language I didn't understand. Colonel Brennan held up his hand, stopping her. You expect me to believe that an explosion powerful enough to throw you 50 yards only left you with minor injuries? No broken bones? No serious burns? Sarah pulled up the sleeve of her shirt, revealing a series of deep cuts and bruises along her arm. I wasn't uninjured, sir. I had these, plus a concussion and several cracked ribs. The medics at the field hospital documented everything. The colonel glanced at her arm but didn't seem impressed. Superficial wounds, Lieutenant? Nothing that couldn't have been self-inflicted to support your story. The accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud. Sarah felt her anger rising, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting emotional would only make her look more guilty in his eyes. Why would I do that? She asked quietly. What possible reason would I have to make up such a story? Fear, the colonel replied simply. Shame. Self-preservation. Take your pick. I've seen soldiers do worse to avoid facing the consequences of their actions. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to be the only survivor? To have to explain to the families of my friends why I'm alive and they're not. For the first time since the interrogation began, Colonel Brennan's expression softened slightly, but the skepticism remained in his eyes. He had heard countless stories over his career and he had learned to spot the lies. In his mind, Sarah Mitchell's story had too many holes, too many convenient gaps in memory. Let's talk about those 12 miles, he said, changing the subject. You claim you walked all that distance while injured and disoriented. That's a long way to go without encountering anyone or anything. Sarah nodded. I stayed off the main roads. I knew the area was compromised, so I moved through the countryside. I hid during the day and traveled at night. It took me almost 36 hours to reach a position where I felt safe enough to signal for extraction. The colonel flipped through more pages in the folder. And in all that time you never thought to try to contact base? To call for backup? To check if any of your teammates had survived? My radio was destroyed in the explosion, Sarah explained, and my satellite phone was back in the vehicle. I had nothing. I was completely cut off. He studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. You're a trained soldier, Lieutenant. You should have found a way to communicate. You should have tried to make contact. I did what I thought was best for survival, she replied firmly. If I had tried to use any electronic device, I could have given away my position. The enemy was actively searching the area. I saw their patrols. I heard their dogs. If I had been caught, I would be dead right now, or worse. Colonel Brennan closed the folder and leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Here's what I think happened. I think your unit was compromised because someone made a mistake. Maybe it was you. Maybe it was someone else. But when the ambush happened, you panicked and ran. You left your teammates to die while you saved yourself. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. The accusation was so unfair, so completely wrong, that she could barely process it. But she knew that arguing would only make things worse. That's not what happened, she said quietly, her voice breaking slightly. I did everything I could to survive. That's what we're trained to do. Survive and report back. That's exactly what I did. The colonel stood up and gathered his papers. I'm recommending a full investigation into this incident. Until we can determine exactly what happened, you're relieved of duty and confined to base. You're not to speak to anyone about this mission without authorization. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, feeling numb. "Yes, sir." As the colonel walked toward the door, he paused and looked back at her. "I hope for your sake that you're telling the truth, Lieutenant. Because if you're lying, you'll spend the rest of your life in military prison." The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, leaving Sarah alone in the interrogation room. She put her head in her hands and finally let the tears fall. She had told the truth, every word of it, but no one believed her. And now she had to find a way to prove her innocence before it was too late. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, marking each second of her nightmare. Somewhere out there, the people responsible for the ambush were still free. And somewhere in this base, there had to be evidence that would prove she was telling the truth. She just had to find it before Colonel Brennan destroyed her career and her life. Asterisk. 3 days had passed since the interrogation, and Sarah felt like a prisoner in her own barracks. The other soldiers avoided her in the hallways, their eyes full of judgment and suspicion. News traveled fast on a military base, and everyone had heard that she was under investigation for abandoning her unit. Some whispered that she was a coward. Others said she might have been working with the enemy all along. Sarah spent most of her time in her small room, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of that night over and over in her mind. She kept wondering if there was something she could have done differently. Maybe if she had been faster getting back to the extraction point. Maybe if she had tried harder to find her teammates. The guilt was eating her alive, even though she knew she had done everything possible to survive. On the 4th day, there was a knock on her door. Sarah opened it to find Captain Alina Rodriguez standing in the hallway. Alina was a medical officer who had treated Sarah when she first returned to base. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that Sarah had always respected. "Can I come in?" Alina asked, her voice quiet. Sarah stepped aside and let her enter. Alina closed the door behind her and looked around the sparse room before turning to face Sarah. "How are you holding up?" Alina asked. Sarah shrugged. "I've been better. What brings you here?" Alina pulled out a tablet from her bag and sat down on the edge of the bed. "I've been reviewing your medical files from when you came back, the initial examination and the follow-up tests. And I found something that I think you need to see." Sarah's heart began to race. "What is it?" Alina swiped through several screens on the tablet before turning it toward Sarah. The screen showed X-ray images of her torso and arms. Sarah could see the bones clearly outlined against the dark background. "When you first came in, we documented all your visible injuries," Alina explained. "The cuts, the bruises, the cracked ribs. But we also did a full body scan to check for internal damage. And that's when we found these." She zoomed in on a particular area of the X-ray, pointing to several small white spots scattered throughout Sarah's shoulder and upper arm. Sarah leaned closer, trying to understand what she was looking at. "What are those?" she asked. "Shrapnel," Alina replied. "Metallic fragments embedded in your tissue. Some of them are quite deep. They're consistent with injuries from an explosive device, exactly like you described in your report." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Can you prove that?" Alina nodded. "I already sent the images to a specialist at the military medical center. He confirmed that the pattern and depth of the fragments matched the type of explosion you reported. This isn't something you could have faked, Sarah. This is real evidence that supports your story." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "Does Colonel Brennan know about this?" "Not yet," Alina said. "I wanted to talk to you first. But I'm going to send him my full report today. This changes everything." Sarah sat down on the bed next to Alina, her hands shaking slightly. "Why didn't they find this during the initial examination?" "The fragments are small," Alina explained. "They weren't causing any immediate medical problems, so they didn't show up on the preliminary assessment. It wasn't until we did the comprehensive scans that we discovered them. And honestly, with everything that was happening, the initial focus was just on stabilizing you and making sure you didn't have any life-threatening injuries." Sarah looked at the X-ray images again, studying the small white dots that represented pieces of metal lodged in her body. Each one was a tiny piece of evidence that proved she had been telling the truth all along. There's something else, Elena continued. I also reviewed the medical reports from the other members of your unit, the ones whose bodies were recovered from the ambush site. Sarah's stomach twisted at the mention of her fallen teammates. What about them? They all had similar shrapnel wounds, Elena said softly. The same pattern, the same type of fragments? It's clear that you were all caught in the same explosion. There's no way you could have inflicted these injuries on yourself. There's no way you could have avoided being at the scene when it happened. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. It was validation that she desperately needed, but it also brought back the painful memories of that night. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for believing me. Lena put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. I never doubted you. I've seen too many combat injuries to be fooled by a fake story, but I'm glad we have concrete evidence now. This should be enough to clear your name. That afternoon, Elena submitted her medical report to Colonel Brennan's office. Sarah waited anxiously in her room, hoping that the evidence would be enough to change his mind. She knew that military investigations moved slowly, and there would still be a lot of questions to answer. But at least now, she had proof that she wasn't lying. 2 hours later, there was another knock on her door. This time it was Sergeant Major David Hayes, one of the senior officers on base. He was a tall man with a stern face, but Sarah had always found him to be fair and reasonable. Lieutenant Mitchell, he said formally. Colonel Brennan wants to see you in his office immediately. Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped that the medical report would speak for itself, but apparently the colonel wanted to question her again. She followed Sergeant Major Hayes through the maze of corridors that led to the administrative building. Other soldiers stared as she passed. She could feel their eyes burning into her back. When they reached the colonel's office, Hayes knocked twice and then opened the door. Colonel Brennan was sitting behind his desk. The medical report spread out in front of him. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was also there, standing near the window. The colonel looked up as Sarah entered, his expression unreadable. Sit down, Lieutenant, he said, gesturing to a chair. Sarah sat, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She was determined to maintain her composure no matter what happened next. Colonel Brennan picked up one of the X-ray images and studied it for a long moment. Dr. Rodriguez has presented some interesting findings, he said slowly. Findings that, I must admit, I did not expect. Sarah remained silent, waiting for him to continue. The shrapnel wounds are consistent with your account of the ambush, the colonel continued. They show that you were indeed caught in an explosion, just as you claimed. This is significant evidence in your favor. Sarah felt a small sense of relief, but she could tell from his tone that there was more to come. However, Colonel Brennan said, setting down the X-ray, this doesn't explain everything. It proves you were at the scene of the explosion, but it doesn't explain why you were found 12 miles away. It doesn't explain why your weapon was clean and your uniform was relatively intact. And it doesn't explain why no one else survived. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Sir, with respect, I've already explained all of that. The explosion threw me clear of the initial attack. By the time I regained consciousness, the fighting was over. I survived because I was lucky, not because I ran away. Dr. Rodriguez spoke up from her position by the window. Colonel, if I may, the nature and location of Lieutenant Mitchell's injuries are consistent with being thrown by a blast. She has bruising on her back and legs that indicates she landed hard on the ground. She also has a concussion that matches the timeline she provided. Everything in the medical evidence supports her version of events. The colonel drummed his fingers on the desk, clearly struggling with the decision he had to make. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a man who prided himself on being able to read people, and her story had challenged his instincts from the beginning. I'm ordering a full forensic analysis of the ambush site, he finally said. I want every piece of evidence collected and examined. Shell casings, vehicle wreckage, body positions, everything. If your story is true, Lieutenant, then the evidence will support it. And if it does, Sarah asked, will you clear my name? Colonel Brennan met her gaze. If the evidence supports your account, then yes, you'll be cleared of any wrongdoing. But until then, you remain on restricted duty. You're not to leave the base or discuss this matter with anyone outside of this investigation. Is that understood? Yes, sir, Sarah replied. As she stood to leave, the colonel added, "Lieutenant, I hope you understand that I'm just doing my job. It's my responsibility to question everything and everyone when something like this happens." "It's not personal," Sarah nodded. "I understand, sir. But I hope you also understand what it's like to have your integrity questioned when you know you've done nothing wrong." The colonel didn't respond, but something flickered in his eyes. Maybe it was doubt, or maybe it was the beginning of belief. Sarah couldn't tell. As she left the office with Dr. Rodriguez, Elena put a comforting hand on her arm. "This is progress," she said quietly. "The medical evidence is solid. Once they examine the site and find more proof, you'll be cleared." "I hope you're right," Sarah replied. But deep down, she knew that even if she was officially cleared, some people would always doubt her. That was the price of being the sole survivor. She would carry that burden for the rest of her life. That evening, Sarah lay in her bed and thought about her fallen teammates. Captain Reynolds, who always had a joke ready even in the most tense situations. Sergeant Davis, who had taught her everything she knew about vehicle maintenance. Corporal Jackson, Private Lee, and Private Martinez, all of them so young and full of potential. They deserved justice, and she was determined to help find it. The shrapnel in her body was a permanent reminder of that terrible night. But now, it was also proof that she had been there, that she had fought, and that she had survived. It was evidence that would speak louder than any word she could say. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to convince Colonel Brennan and everyone else that she was telling the truth. The forensic team arrived at the base 6 days after Sarah's second meeting with Colonel Brennan. They were specialists from the military's Criminal Investigation Division, trained to reconstruct combat scenarios and determine exactly what had happened in situations where the truth was unclear. Sarah watched from her barracks window as they unloaded their equipment from a convoy of vehicles. Knowing that her future depended on what they would find, Lieutenant Commander James Peterson led the forensic team. He was a methodical man in his mid-50s who had spent 25 years analyzing military incidents. His reputation for finding the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried, was legendary throughout the armed forces. He reported directly to Colonel Brennan, but his loyalty was only to the facts. Sarah wasn't allowed to accompany the team to the ambush site, but she heard updates through the grapevine. The investigation would take several days, possibly even weeks. They would examine every inch of the area, collecting samples, taking measurements, and documenting everything they found. It was painstaking work that required patience and precision. On the third day of the investigation, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Major Thomas Wright, a military attorney from the Judge Advocate General's office, appeared at her door with a briefcase under his arm. He was younger than Sarah expected, probably in his late 30s, with sharp eyes and a careful way of speaking. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "I've been assigned as your legal counsel during this investigation. May I come in?" Sarah shook his hand and let him enter. She had been expecting legal representation, but she was still nervous about what his presence might mean. Major Wright sat down and opened his briefcase, pulling out several folders. "I've reviewed your case file and spoken with Dr. Rodriguez about the medical evidence. I've also had preliminary conversations with Lieutenant Commander Peterson about the forensic investigation." "What did he say?" Sarah asked eagerly. "He's not ready to share his findings yet," Wright replied. "But between you and me, I think things are looking better for you than Colonel Brennan initially believed." Sarah felt a wave of relief, but she tried not to get too hopeful. "What makes you say that?" Wright pulled out a document and showed it to her. It was a preliminary report from the forensic team marked as confidential. "This is unofficial, and I'm only showing you this because I believe you have a right to know what they're finding. But you cannot discuss this with anyone else." "Understood?" "Understood," Sarah agreed. She began reading the report, her eyes scanning the technical language and detailed observations. The team had found evidence of multiple explosive devices at the ambush site, all consistent with military-grade ordnance. They had also recovered shell casings from various weapons, indicating that there had been a significant firefight. Most importantly, they had found blood evidence at multiple locations that matched the DNA of Sarah and her fallen teammates. They found traces of your blood approximately 47 yards from the primary blast site, Wright explained, pointing to a section of the report. The blood trail shows that you were injured in the initial explosion and then moved away from the immediate danger zone. This is consistent with your account of being thrown by the blast and then regaining consciousness in a ditch. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. So they believe me now? The evidence is strongly in your favor, Wright said carefully. But there are still some questions that need to be answered. For example, the forensic team is trying to determine why the enemy knew exactly where to set up the ambush. Someone had to have provided intelligence about your extraction point. Sarah had been thinking about this question for days. I don't know how they found out. Our mission was classified. Only a handful of people knew the details. Wright nodded thoughtfully. That's what concerns me. This wasn't a random attack. It was well planned and perfectly executed. Someone on the inside may have leaked information. The implications of that statement hung in the air. If there was a traitor on the base, then Sarah's ordeal was about much more than just proving her innocence. It meant that the entire unit might be compromised. Have they found any evidence of who might have leaked the information? Sarah asked. Not yet, Wright replied. But Lieutenant Commander Peterson is looking into it. He's examining communication logs, mission briefings, and personnel records. If there's a leak, he'll find it. Over the next several days, Sarah continued to wait anxiously for the results of the investigation. She spent her time writing detailed accounts of everything she remembered from the mission, hoping that some small detail might help the forensic team understand what had happened. She also attended several more meetings with Major Wright, who helped her prepare for the inevitable questions that would come once the investigation was complete. On the 10th day, Lieutenant Commander Peterson returned to the base with his final report. Sarah learned about it from Major Wright, who came to her room with a cautious smile on his face. Peterson has completed his analysis, Wright said. He's presenting his findings to Colonel Brennan this afternoon. I've been invited to attend, and I've requested that you be present as well. Sarah's heart began to race. What did he find? I don't know all the details yet, Wright admitted. But Peterson told me that his findings will, and I quote, change the entire narrative of this case. That sounds promising to me. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself back in Colonel Brennan's office, this time with Major Wright sitting beside her. Lieutenant Commander Peterson was there as well, along with several other senior officers who had been involved in the investigation. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but Professional Peterson stood at the front of the room with a presentation displayed on a large screen behind him. He was a calm, measured speaker who presented his findings with the precision of a surgeon. After 10 days of intensive investigation at the ambush site, Peterson began, My team has collected and analyzed over 300 pieces of physical evidence. This includes explosive residue, ballistic evidence, biological samples, and environmental data. I will now present our conclusions. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed map of the ambush site with various markers indicating where evidence had been found. The attack on Lieutenant Mitchell's unit was a coordinated ambush involving at least 15 to 20 enemy combatants. They used multiple IEDs planted along the road leading to the extraction point, as well as small arms fire from elevated positions on both sides of the route. Colonel Brennan leaned forward in his chair. Studying the map intently, Peterson continued. The first explosion occurred when the lead vehicle triggered an ED buried approximately 6 inches below the surface of the road. The blast was powerful enough to completely destroy the vehicle and kill the 3 occupants instantly. Analysis of the crater and debris pattern confirms this. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes as she listened to the clinical description of how her friends had died. Major Wright noticed and quietly handed her a tissue. The second vehicle, which carried Lieutenant Mitchell, Captain Reynolds, and Private Martinez, was hit by a subsequent explosion approximately 3.2 seconds later. However, this explosion was less powerful and occurred slightly to the side of the vehicle rather than directly underneath it. Peterson clicked to another slide showing photographs of the destroyed vehicle. Sarah had to look away. The images were too painful to see. Based on the position of the wreckage and the distribution of biological evidence, We can determine that Lieutenant Mitchell was sitting in the rear passenger side of the vehicle. When the explosion occurred, the blast waved through her clear of the vehicle before it caught fire. She landed approximately 47 yards away in a drainage ditch, which likely saved her life by providing cover from the subsequent gunfire. He paused and looked directly at Sarah. Lieutenant Mitchell's injuries, including the shrapnel wounds documented by Dr. Rodriguez, are completely consistent with this scenario. There is no possibility that these injuries were self-inflicted or fabricated in any way. Sarah saw Colonel Brennan's expression change slightly. The skepticism that had been so evident in their previous meetings was beginning to fade. Peterson clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of events. After the initial explosions, enemy combatants engaged the remaining survivors with small arms fire for approximately 8 to 12 minutes. We found evidence that Captain Reynolds and Private Martinez attempted to return fire and establish a defensive position, but they were outnumbered and eventually overwhelmed. What about Lieutenant Mitchell during this time? One of the other officers asked. Based on the evidence and her medical condition, Lieutenant Mitchell was unconscious during most of the firefight. When she regained consciousness, the enemy had already left the scene, taking weapons and equipment with them. She was alone, injured, and behind enemy lines with no means of communication. Peterson clicked to another slide showing a map of the surrounding area. Lieutenant Mitchell then traveled approximately 12 miles on foot over a period of 36 hours, avoiding enemy patrols and seeking a safe location for extraction. We found physical evidence along this route, including blood traces and fabric fibers that match her uniform, confirming her account of the journey. Colonel Brennan spoke up for the first time. Lieutenant Commander Peterson, in your professional opinion, did Lieutenant Mitchell act appropriately given the circumstances she faced? Peterson didn't hesitate. Absolutely, sir. She survived a catastrophic ambush, evaded capture, successfully made it back to friendly territory while seriously injured. Her actions demonstrate remarkable resilience and tactical awareness. Many soldiers would not have survived what she went through. The room fell silent as everyone processed this information. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and grief washing over her. She had been vindicated, but her teammates were still gone. Nothing could bring them back. Peterson wasn't finished. He clicked to a new slide that showed communication logs and personnel records. There is one more critical finding from our investigation. We discovered evidence that suggests the enemy had advanced knowledge of the mission parameters, including the extraction point location. This information could only have come from someone with access to classified mission briefings. The atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. Everyone leaned forward, paying close attention to what Peterson was saying. We are currently investigating several individuals who had access to this information. I cannot disclose names at this time, but I can tell you that we believe we are close to identifying the source of the leak. This is now a counterintelligence matter as well as a combat investigation. Colonel Brennan stood up, his face grave. Lieutenant Mitchell, on behalf of this command, I owe you an apology. I questioned your integrity and your courage based on incomplete information and my own assumptions. The evidence clearly shows that you acted with honor and bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. I was wrong to doubt you. Sarah was stunned. She had hoped to be cleared, but she hadn't expected such a direct apology from the colonel. Thank you, sir, she managed to say. You are hereby restored to full duty status, Brennan continued. All restrictions are lifted, and your record will reflect that you acted appropriately throughout this incident. I will also be recommending you for a commendation for your actions during and after the ambush. Major Wright smiled and squeezed Sarah's shoulder supportively. It was finally over. She had been vindicated by the evidence, and her name would be cleared. But as she left the colonel's office that day, she knew that the real work was just beginning. Someone on the base had betrayed her unit, and she was determined to help find out who it was. The days following Lieutenant Commander Peterson's presentation were strange for Sarah. Word spread quickly through the base that she had been cleared of all wrongdoing, and the soldiers who had once avoided her now treated her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Some approached her to offer apologies for doubting her. Others simply nodded in acknowledgement when they passed her in the hallways. But Sarah found it difficult to enjoy her vindication. Her mind was consumed with one question: who had betrayed her unit? Major Wright kept her informed about the counterintelligence investigation, though he warned her that the process would be slow and methodical. The investigators were reviewing months of communication logs, tracking everyone who had access to classified mission information, and looking for any suspicious patterns or connections to enemy forces. Sarah threw herself back into her duties, grateful to have something to occupy her mind. She was assigned to a desk job temporarily while she completed her physical recovery. The shrapnel wounds were healing, but Dr. Rodriguez wanted to wait before clearing her for combat operations. Sarah spent her days reviewing intelligence reports and helping plan future missions, always watching for any signs of suspicious activity among the personnel around her. 2 weeks after her exoneration, Colonel Brennan called her to his office again. This time his demeanor was different. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. Lieutenant Commander Peterson was also present, along with a woman Sarah didn't recognize. She wore civilian clothes, but her bearing suggested military training. "Lieutenant Mitchell, this is Special Agent Rebecca Chase from Army Counterintelligence," Brennan said, gesturing to the woman. "She's been leading the investigation into the intelligence leak." Agent Chase shook Sarah's hand firmly. "Lieutenant, I've heard a lot about you. Your survival story is remarkable." "Thank you," Sarah replied, taking a seat. "Have you found the person responsible for the leak?" Chase exchanged a glance with Colonel Brennan before answering. "We have. But before I tell you who it is, I need to explain how we discovered them. It's a complicated story." Sarah leaned forward, her full attention on the agent. "After analyzing all the communication logs and personnel files, we narrowed our suspects down to 7 individuals who had complete access to your mission parameters," Chase began. "All 7 were questioned extensively. 6 of them checked out clean. But one person's story didn't quite add up." She pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a photograph. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was Master Sergeant Kyle Harrison, a logistics coordinator who had been on the base for 3 years. Sarah knew him casually. He had always been friendly and professional, with no apparent red flags in his behavior. "Harrison," Sarah said in disbelief. "Why would he do this?" "Money," Chase replied bluntly. "We found evidence that he had been passing information to enemy contacts for the past 8 months. He was being paid substantial amounts through untraceable cryptocurrency transfers. Your mission wasn't the first one he compromised, but it was the first one that resulted in casualties." Sarah felt sick. All those deaths, all that suffering, because someone wanted to make money? "How did you catch him?" Lieutenant Commander Peterson spoke up. "We found inconsistencies in his financial records. He had been making purchases and investments that were far beyond what his salary could support. When we confronted him with this evidence, he initially claimed he had won money gambling. But when we dug deeper, we found the cryptocurrency accounts." "Confessed yesterday," Chase added. "Once he realized we had enough evidence to convict him, he cooperated fully. He provided names of his contacts and details about other missions he had compromised. We're still working through all the information, but it's already led to several significant arrests on the enemy side." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "I want to see him. I want to ask him why he did this." Colonel Brennan shook his head. "That's not a good idea, Lieutenant. Harrison is in custody and will be court-martialed. You'll have an opportunity to testify at his trial, but confronting him now won't change anything." "He got my friends killed," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "Captain Reynolds, Sergeant Davis, all of them. They died because this man wanted money." "I understand your anger," Chase said gently. "But the best thing you can do now is focus on moving forward. Harrison will face justice. He's looking at life in prison, possibly even the death penalty, depending on what the court-martial decides. He will pay for what he did." Sarah took several deep breaths, trying to calm herself. She knew they were right, but the rage she felt was overwhelming. For weeks, she had been blamed and doubted, while the real traitor had been walking around free. It was unbearably unfair. "There's something else you should know," Peterson said. "Harrison's betrayal goes beyond just your mission. We believe he was responsible for at least 4 other compromised operations over the past 8 months. Some resulted in failed missions. Others led to casualties. Your case is what finally exposed him because of the intensity of the investigation. Sarah looked up at him. So if I hadn't survived, he might never have been caught. It's possible, Peterson admitted. The investigation into your ambush was more thorough than previous incidents because of the total loss of the unit. That level of scrutiny is what led us to examine the intelligence leak angle so carefully. In a way, your survival and your insistence on telling the truth is what brought him down. Sarah sat back in her chair, processing this information. She had spent so many nights wondering if she could have done something differently to save her teammates. Now she understood that their deaths, while tragic, had served a purpose. They had exposed a traitor who might have gone on to cause even more damage. What happens now? Sarah asked. Colonel Brennan folded his hands on his desk. Harrison's court-martial will begin in approximately 6 weeks. You'll be called to testify about the mission and the aftermath. Beyond that, we need to discuss your future with this unit.
Ow.
Sarah's heart sank. Are you transferring me? Not unless you want to be transferred, Brennan replied. But I think you should consider it. What happened to you was traumatic, and staying here might make it difficult to move past it. Sometimes a fresh start in a new location can be beneficial. Sarah considered this carefully. Part of her wanted to leave, to get away from the memories and the whispers. But another part of her felt like leaving would be abandoning her fallen teammates. They had died serving this unit, and she felt obligated to honor their memory by continuing their mission. I want to stay, she said firmly. At least for now. I need to see Harrison's trial through. After that, I'll make a decision about my future. Brennan nodded approvingly. That's acceptable. But I want you to continue working with the base psychologist. Dr. Martinez has experience with combat trauma and survivor's guilt. I think regular sessions would be beneficial.
I agree, Sarah said.
She had already been attending therapy sessions, and they had been helpful in processing everything she had experienced. Agent Chase stood up, preparing to leave. Lieutenant Mitchell, I want to commend you for your strength throughout this ordeal. Not many people could have endured what you went through and come out the other side with their integrity intact. The Army is lucky to have you. After Chase and Peterson left, Sarah remained alone with Colonel Brennan. There was an awkward silence between them, the memory of their initial confrontation still hanging in the air. Sir, I need to ask you something, Sarah finally said. Go ahead, Brennan replied. Why were you so quick to assume I was lying? Was it just because my story seemed unlikely, or was there something else? The colonel was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. I've been in the military for 30 years, he said slowly. In that time, I've seen soldiers do incredible things. I've also seen them lie, cheat, and betray their comrades. I've learned to be skeptical, to question everything, because assuming the best in people can sometimes lead to dangerous mistakes. He paused, his expression troubled. But in your case, I let my skepticism override my judgment. I should have waited for all the evidence before making assumptions about your character. The truth is, I made the same mistake that many investigators make. I constructed a theory about what happened, and then I looked for evidence to support that theory instead of letting the evidence guide me to the truth. Sarah appreciated his honesty. I understand, sir. I just wish you had given me the benefit of the doubt. So do I, Brennan admitted. I failed you, Lieutenant. And I failed your fallen teammates by not immediately focusing on finding out what really happened. That's a mistake I'll have to live with. They sat in silence for a moment, two soldiers who had both been changed by the events of the past few weeks. For what it's worth, Brennan continued, I think you're going to have a distinguished career. What you survived would have broken most people. But you fought back, you told the truth, and you didn't let anyone intimidate you into backing down. That takes real courage. Sarah stood up to leave. Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from you. As she walked out of the colonel's office, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had been vindicated not just by the evidence, but by the respect of the man who had doubted her most. It didn't erase the pain of losing her teammates or the trauma of the ambush, but it was a start toward healing. Over the following weeks, Sarah continued her recovery and her duties. She attended Harrison's preliminary hearings. Sitting in the courtroom and watching the man who had betrayed her unit try to justify his actions, his defense attorney argued that he had been coerced by enemy forces, that he had feared for his life and had no choice but to cooperate. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the court-martial board saw through his lies. On the day of the verdict, Sarah sat in the front row of the courtroom, alongside the families of her fallen teammates. Captain Reynolds' parents were there, along with Sergeant Davis's wife and young daughter. They had all traveled to the base to see justice served. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, Harrison showed no emotion. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the military police led him away, he glanced briefly at Sarah, but she refused to meet his eyes. He didn't deserve even that small acknowledgement. After the trial, Sarah met with the families of her teammates. They thanked her for surviving, for telling the truth, and for helping to bring their loved one's killer to justice. Captain Reynolds' mother hugged her tightly and whispered, "My son always said you were the strongest person in his unit. Now I understand why." Those words stayed with Sarah as she began to rebuild her life. She continued to serve with distinction, eventually earning a promotion and a transfer to a special operations unit where she could put her experiences to good use training other soldiers. She never forgot the night of the ambush or the friends she had lost. But she learned to carry that pain in a way that made her stronger, rather than breaking her. Colonel Brennan wrote a letter of commendation that became part of her permanent record, documenting not just her survival, but her character and integrity throughout the investigation. He also implemented new security protocols to prevent future intelligence leaks, ensuring that other units wouldn't suffer the same fate. Years later, Sarah would look back on those difficult weeks as a turning point in her life. The ambush had tried to destroy her. The investigation had tried to break her, but she had survived both. She had learned that the truth, no matter how painful or difficult to prove, would always come to light eventually. And she had learned that even in the darkest moments, when everyone doubts you and the evidence seems stacked against you, holding on to your integrity is the most important thing you can do. The shrapnel wounds eventually healed, leaving small scars that served as permanent reminders of that night. But those scars also told a story of survival, of resilience, and of truth. They were the physical evidence that had saved her reputation and her career. And in the end, they had helped deliver justice for the friends she had lost and the unit that had been betrayed. Sarah never forgot the lesson she learned from Colonel Brennan's initial skepticism, that perception can be just as important as truth, but that solid evidence will always win in the end. She carried that lesson with her throughout her military career, becoming not just a skilled soldier, but also an advocate for thorough investigations and fair treatment of service members accused of wrongdoing. The story of the lieutenant whose alibi was doubted until the shrapnel wounds told a different story became something of a legend on military bases around the world. It was told to new recruits as an example of why evidence matters, why thorough investigations are essential, and why the truth, no matter how unlikely it might seem, deserves to be heard and carefully examined. And at the heart of that story was Sarah Mitchell, a soldier who refused to back down, who survived against impossible odds, and who proved that sometimes the smallest pieces of evidence can tell the biggest truths.